I am going to get rid of all the normal introductions and get to them after Toby Young does his speech talk first on the situation of academic freedom in Britain. Toby Young is founder and general secretary of the Free Speech Union of the United Kingdom. Going straight to Toby, and then we'll, after he does his talk, everybody else. Toby.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I don't have more time, but I do have 15 minutes to tell you about the Free Speech Union. So I founded the Free Speech Union in February of last year. It was partly prompted by attending a conference at Oxford in 2019, which various academics who'd been cancelled or who'd been targeted by outrage mobs for cancellation attended. And they included Bruce Gilley, actually, who's one of the panelists in this discussion. And we spoke at that conference about what we could do to try and push back against cancel culture in higher education, to protect academics like Bruce targeted by outrage mobs for political reasons. And I suggested that it might be a good idea to set up an organisation which didn't just campaign to protect the free speech of academics, but for people more widely. And people thought that was a good idea, and I went away and thought about it a bit more. And in February, I launched the Free Speech Union, and the chairman of the board is Professor Nigel Biggar of Oxford, who had convened this conference. Nigel is doing some research into the legacy of the British Empire, and because he had been quite nuanced in what he'd said about the British Empire, and because he'd said he didn't think it was just an unbroken litany of exploitation and self-deception and colonial conquest. He was targeted for cancellation in 2017, and a couple of open letters were circulated denouncing him, and one of his colleagues withdrew from his Empire project. So he'd been bruised by this experience and wanted to try and do something about it, and so agreed to become the chair of the Free Speech Union. And I thought in February of last year that the state of free speech couldn't get any worse across the Anglosphere, that it had never been in greater peril, but that it had reached a low point. We touched bottom. And what I hadn't anticipated is that two things over the course of the next 15 months would actually make things a great deal worse. The first was the pandemic, with lots of people who challenge the official COVID narrative being cancelled, including people in the hard sciences, which I think is a relatively new development. So we've seen, for instance, the signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration, the original signatories, Sunetra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya, finding it really quite tough to be given space to set out their critique of the lockdown policies pursued across the Western world in response to this viral outbreak. And some of them have found themselves smeared as, in the pay of far-right billionaires and neoliberals and so forth. I mean, the attacks on them and their reputations have been pretty vicious because they've dared to dissent from the kind of prevailing orthodoxy about COVID-19. I think that's a new development, seeing that kind of intellectual intolerance invade the hard sciences. But we've also, I think, perhaps more significantly, the Black Lives Matter movement that sprung up in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. That has produced a tsunami of cancellations. We've had lots and lots of members contact us reaching out for help because they've been targeted in their universities, in their workplaces, for challenging the BLM narrative. I'll give you one example, probably one of the most shocking examples. A senior executive of one of the, I think is it the big five accountancy firms, a global international corporation. The CEO of that corporation, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, sent out one of these pro forma emails, which he sent to everyone in the company, saying, it's high time, it's past time we had an open conversation about race. We've been sweeping racism under the carpet for too long. We as a company are not innocent of this. We need to address this. We need to confront it. We need to have an open, honest conversation about this. And one of the senior employees of this company took that letter, that email, at face value, and was slightly disturbed that the reading list that accompanied this email was included books like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, White Fragility, and so forth. All the books informed by critical race theory, very much from the woke perspective, but no books from the other side. There weren't any books by Shelby Steele, for instance, by Thomas Sowell, nothing like that. And so this senior executive thought, well, yeah, let's have an open conversation, took this email at face value and replied, copying in everyone, saying, yeah, I think it's really important we have this conversation. Let's read these books you've recommended on your reading list, but let's also read these books, and recommended some other books, like by the authors I've just mentioned. And he also recommended Douglas Murray's Madness of Crowds. And as a result of sending this email in good faith, just suggesting that people in the company might want to consider an alternative perspective on these same issues, he was suspended and placed under investigation by that company. And the Free Speech Union found him an employment barrister, an attorney who represented him in that investigation. And eventually he reached a settlement agreement with the company and left the company. But that was absolutely typical of the way large corporations, big universities, theatre companies, other arts organisations, big charities responded in the wake of the BLM movement. It was as though they suddenly decided that their companies were riddled from top to bottom with racism, and they needed to have a kind of a reckoning within their companies to eliminate the stain of racial injustice, and that often involved throwing people out the window who challenged that particular narrative. So the Free Speech Union is incredibly busy. We get about 50 requests for help every week. We are able to help about half of them. We've got one full-time case management director, a full-time chief legal counsel, a full-time case officer. It's never been more needed, and we're beginning to open international branches. So we've opened a branch in New Zealand that launched last month, and we're hoping to open a branch in the US, which will launch in the autumn, and in due course we're hoping to launch in Canada. I'll leave you with one thought, which is it's surprising how effective a bit of pushing back can be. I think often people are intimidated by outraged mobs of woke activists, and they're reluctant to push back. I think the human impulse when faced with a really aggressive mob is to start running in the opposite direction. That's a kind of atavistic impulse, which is quite hard to overcome. But if you can overcome that impulse, particularly if you have the support of an organisation with some resources and some expertise like the Free Speech Union, and you pushed back in an organised, robust way, it's surprising how effective that can be. So I'll give you one example. Towards the end of last year, an academic at the University of Chicago called Dorian Abbott was targeted for cancellation by a group of grad students, some junior faculty at the University of Chicago, because he had dared to question the University of Chicago's affirmative action policies, particularly when it came to hiring faculty. And he produced a few YouTube videos in which, he made the case for a meritocratic admissions policy and a meritocratic faculty hiring policy. Nothing, remotely controversial or even particularly There's nothing inflammatory about the language he used, nothing like that. But he was immediately accused of being an apologist for white supremacy, being a racist. Various students, graduate students, said they wouldn't feel safe. Students of colour wouldn't feel safe being taught by him in his classes because he'd expressed such abhorrent racist views and so on and so forth. And a petition was started, an open letter circulated calling for him to be denuded of various teaching responsibilities, the whole 9 yards. Exactly the same sort of thing that happened to Bruce Gilley. I think happened twice now to Bruce Gilley. And the Free Speech Union started a petition addressed to the president of the University of Chicago, asking him to reaffirm the Chicago principles, pointing out that for many people in the academy, the Chicago principles are the gold standard when it comes to protecting free speech. And if they're not lived up to by the University of Chicago, what hope is there for the rest of us? So urging the president of the university to stand up for these principles, reaffirm them, and affirm that nothing would happen to Professor Abbott as a result of this campaign to essentially ruin his livelihood. Within a few days, we got up to, I think, around 15,000 signatures. And within about 3 days of our issuing the petition, the president of the University of Chicago issued a statement affirming Chicago's commitment to the Chicago principles, and without naming Professor Abbott, making it very clear that no harm should come to him or to any other faculty at the University of Chicago just for saying something that others disagreed with. And after that, the mob dispersed, and as far as I know, Dorian Abbott is still working at the University of Chicago. So I think that was a really good object lesson in how, if you push back against these censorious mobs, if you show a bit of steel, they very often back down. I think it's the age-old story with bullies. They're intimidating and can be quite scary. But if you stand up to them, if you nail your courage to the sticking place and stand up to them, then they often run away. And that's the heartening thing, I think. The most heartening thing about what I've discovered since setting up the Free Speech Union is just how many victories we've had just by standing up, pushing back, being robust in the face of calls to cancel people. It's really been quite surprising by how many of these mobs have backed down. So I hope we can create a network of similar organisations across the Anglosphere. I know the National Association of Scholars has been fantastic in this regard, and Peter Wood gave me some very helpful advice when I was setting up the Free Speech Union. But unlike the NAS, we don't just confine ourselves to the higher education sector. We're a society-wide organisation that stands up for ordinary people, even in some cases bus drivers, train drivers, plumbers, electricians, all of whom find themselves being targeted for having broken some written or unwritten speech code, but in nearly every case for having said something which ordinary people would not consider remotely controversial or unacceptable.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, I'm that is the finish of your talk, or?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say. I spoke without notes as per your instructions, so hope it didn't seem too disjointed.
Lovely. Well, if you have any more time to stay on, I will just then go quickly then to the introductions to our other people, or rather, I will just very briefly. So this is the National Association of Scholars, the event fighting for academic freedom in America, Canada, and Britain. We are being recorded. This will be available to everybody. It should be within 24 hours on our YouTube channel, National Association of Scholars. People who want to provide comments when we get to the comment portion should go to either the chat or the Q&A button below. Any questions which are not answered, everybody should send email to me, randall@nas.org, Director of Research. And however, I'm going to leave my co-moderator, Bruce Oliver Newsom, who teaches political science at the University of San Diego, or at least I think he's moving to the University of Texas and was at San Diego. And he will introduce himself, Mark Mercer, and Bruce Gilley.
Hello. Thank you, David. So, yes, I'm Bruce Oliver Newsom. I lecture on political science at the University of San Diego, shortly moving to the University of Texas, as David's given away there. Yes, I am delighted to get the credit for initiating this discussion. I take pleasure in being a member of both the National Association of Scholars and the Free Speech Union, and I have been impressed with what how both organizations fight to protect free speech, and that protects the profession in which I have chosen to work, academia. So I am pleased that we've got representation from three countries: Canada, Britain, and the United States. I sort of bridge the two of those countries, Britain and the United States. I've taught in academia in both countries. I'm a dual citizen, so I bring some compare and contrast between the two systems. Now, we have Bruce Gilley to start our next presentation after Toby Young. Bruce Gilley, a fellow political scientist at Portland. Bruce number two, or the second Bruce, Bruce Gilley, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the academic free speech is not about, and I'm going to actually think about where we need to focus our attention. And I'm going to kind of start with what I think is the sort of least important challenge, or the least significant challenge for academic freedom. And more generally, I think this applies to what Toby talked about, free speech in society more generally, and then sort of move towards where I think, the focus really needs to be. So I think a lot of academic freedom discussions in the United States, UK, and Canada as well, and Australia for that matter. I mean, it'd be great to have someone from Australia, because I think the challenges in the Anglosphere are very similar. Focuses on kind of campus silliness, right? Speakers being canceled, and signs being torn down, and student groups being deregistered, and speakers not being allowed to speak on campus. And this is kind of what I call kind of, that sort of no platforming, kind of campus follies question. And certainly that's important, right, for a university. And again, you could just apply this to arts organizations, to the media, to corporations, to sports organizations. I mean, all of this analysis applies to any other sphere of the cultural institutions of our societies. And I think that's important, but I think we get much too carried away with kind of no platforming, campus follies kind of things. And I don't think it's really what matters to a free society and to academic freedom more generally, if only because it's largely epiphenomenal. It's a result of the bigger structural issues we need to focus on rather than the cause. And it's also kind of playing whack-a-mole, right? You're never gonna solve the campus free speech issues if you don't solve the deeper structural issues. So I think kind of moving then, each of these I'm going to basically talk about 6 pieces. And each of these I think is increasingly important and central. So campus kind of no platforming, my poster was torn down kind of thing, I think is the least significant. The second least significant, not insignificant, but still not that important, is what I call student activism. Now, student activism is important for maintaining campus free speech, just as I would say activism in any organization, whether in a company, James Damore kind of activism within Google, within the media, Barry Weiss kind of activism within the New York Times. I mean, so this kind of like what I call kind of the individual standing up and trying to do something on campus for student activism can be important. The United States actually is quite strong here. We have college Republicans, we have Young Americans for Freedoms, we have Turning Point USA, we have actually quite a bit of student activism. We also have some really well-established student publications, Campus Reform and the College Fix, which use student reporters to kind of out things happening on campus. I think that's great, and I think it's helpful for shining a light. But again, I don't think it really, while it shines a light on academic freedom issues, I don't think kind of generating a tremendous student movement on campus is really going to solve our problems, because I think it's much too weak a reed to hang this problem on. Moving up a level, I would say, Administrative and faculty pluralism is important, right? And of course, the reason we have academic freedom issues is because we don't have administrative or faculty pluralism any longer. Administrators in particular, and faculty as well, have become overwhelmingly dominated by those who believe the censorship of viewpoints that are not progressive or not aligned with the latest left-wing thought liberation of the moment should be stopped. Not called censorship anymore. It's called upholding the values, or upholding academic integrity, or upholding the safety of the campus learning environment. So all these euphemisms have been generated by the faculty, by the administration, to justify a clampdown on viewpoint diversity, clampdown on unpopular speech. That's important. I don't want to underestimate how important that is. I also want to say that part of the problem here with academic freedom is we tend to focus on what I would call the sort of the sort of demographic or statistical pluralism of the faculty, and look at indicators such as, in the US, we look at party alignment, right? Party affiliations. And we'd say, most universities, it's something like 10-1 Democrats to Republicans, and like 100-1 in the humanities and social sciences. But I actually think the problem's worse than that, because actually what we need to look at is what I would call effective pluralism, which is to say those who are active in academic freedom debates. And those who are active in academic freedom debates on campuses are overwhelmingly arguing against academic freedom, in favor of censorship, pushing new diversity training mandates. Our university just imposed a mandatory one-course race and ethnic studies requirement on all students in order to graduate starting next year. So basically Soviet-style indoctrination with forced compelled learning. This kind of activism in the faculty is actually much more skewed in favor of censorship and a reduction of viewpoint diversity than even the demographic faculty administrative profiles would suggest. So this is a big problem. Also, however, not necessarily an impediment to change. The top three areas I think are more important, where you can actually think about change, have to do with kind of structural and policy environments in which institutions of culture, whether universities, arts organizations, sports organizations, media, even companies now, I think, in many ways, companies have become cultural institutions now. Big companies have become essentially cultural institutions. Yes, they produce goods and services, but their footprint is largely cultural now. Indeed, they're trading on their cultural footprint. So I think this applies to them as well. First and foremost, and this is, I think, an area where the United States is actually very strong, is we have a plurality of institutional setups in higher education, just as we have, I think, a much more vigorous capitalist economy than either the UK or Canada. And I think a variety of institutions which are funded in different ways creates a tremendous leverage point for academic freedom. So to the extent that state universities are basically captured by the academic far left today, nonetheless, at least in the United States, we have a tremendous kind of archipelago of private colleges and think tanks and centers of learning that do provide alternative sources of information and places where academic freedom actually survives. Many or most of these in the United States are Catholic, by the way, and we need to come to terms with how important the Catholic Church has been historically to the West, but I would say it's kind of almost coming back in terms of that importance. But maintaining a plurality of institutions is key. And, among the three countries we're talking about, Canada is by far the worst. And I would think Australia is probably the same problem, because they are literally all captured by provincial governments, in any case, the government, and have very little institutional autonomy that is not separable from government funding. That's a problem for Canada. To some extent, less in the UK, because although they're all centrally funded, they do have more autonomous organization. The US has a tremendous pluralism of institutions in the cultural sphere, including higher education. That's a bonus. Second most important thing, which is important, is kind of policy and political support. So to what extent have political and policy elites got on side with the idea that we need to protect a variety of viewpoints and a vigorous contest of ideas? We need to have a very extremely broad measure of free speech And we need to make sure that that's backed up by legal and policy sanctions for those who violate it. So this is one area where I think the UK is actually better than the US because of recently passed legislation that actually imposes penalties on universities that don't uphold free speech. Again, I think as Dr. Newsom's going to talk about, whether this is enforced or not is another issue. But I think having policy and political support is important. We're seeing some action at the state level in the US, but we're not going to expect it in the East or West Coast, where those states are very much captured by democratic governments. But nonetheless, I think that the policy and political atmosphere is really important. I'm going to step back one more, and I'm going to say the most important thing for the protection of free speech and academic freedom in our cultural institutions is what I would call the macro social environment that is either encouraging or discouraging for free speech and advocacy for unpopular causes. I think in this case, the United States is clearly the most broadly and contested intellectual environment among the two. The UK may be a close second, and the UK has the benefit of having two kind of functioning parties that actually alternate in office and actually win, popular majorities, and therefore you do get an alternation of viewpoints at the highest level, reflecting kind of the diversity of viewpoints in society. The United States, a little bit less so, but still we have a very vigorous macro social environment. And the reason I point this out is because, if you go back to the sort of, early 15th century in the UK, when the Renaissance is beginning in England, the beginning of the Renaissance in England, where did that Renaissance come from? It didn't come from the sort of debates inside existing cultural institutions. The existing cultural institutions, the universities and the monasteries, were stagnant and captured by scholasticism and basically politically correct groupthink, right? Boy, where have you heard that before? We're very much in that situation now. Where did the Renaissance come from in England? It came from outsiders. It came from the macro social environment in which new business people with wealth, the so-called dilettante, right, started to fund alternative research, alternative scholarship. And then you had the growth of the humanists outside of the existing cultural institutions. And these are the humanists who, in many cases, were scientists, but believed in recovering classical learning. And I think, ultimately, where are we going to get a renaissance in higher education, in academic freedom, in the defense of the classical principles of learning that made the West? It's going to come from outside of the university. So you can hammer away as much as you want on the universities, but what we need to do is essentially have them degraded from the outside through a vigorous pluralism of ideas. I'm often reminded that James Lindsay, who of course was one of the three scholars in the famous grievance studies hoax papers and now runs an organization called New Discourses. James Lindsay is a mathematician, and it is so true that if you go back to the Renaissance, the people who revived classical learning were scientists and mathematicians. They were the ones who actually had an interest in the revival of classical learning. And I think that, bringing that macro social environment back into play as much as possible is probably what is going to give us a renaissance from what is now the dark ages of free speech and academic freedom. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Professor Gilley. So our third speaker will be Mark Mercer. Mark Mercer is the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Mark, over to you.
Good. Well, thank you very much. The problem is deep. The problem is very deep. At the risk of stating something obvious, I think the general problem is an absence of commitment to academic values and the academic mission of the university. Now, what is the now universities have had non-academic functions as long as there have been universities, and I don't think that if they weren't performing these functions and performing them well, there would be no social support for them. Functions like preparing young people to take their places in the managerial and professional elite, generating research that's of use to people, of use to government. So these are things that universities have always done, but beneath these functions, there's the academic mission, the academic purpose. Basically, people who enjoy their intellectual and moral autonomy coming together in a community with a culture of criticism in order to investigate things in the world, to generate understandings of things in the world, to interpret understandings, to seek evaluations of things, and just the process and the result, the understandings, is what they are there to do, and that's what motivates them, and that's what they love. Now, if you are, let me put it this way: how would we tell whether a person is given to the academic mission, the academic purpose of a university? Well, would they rather believe truly and value soundly, but for reasons of social pressure, or would they rather believe falsely and value unsoundly, but for their own good reasons of evidence and argument? Now, if you say, I'd rather believe falsely and value unsoundly after having examined the matters for myself, thought about them, and come to my own conclusions, then you have a commitment to the academic mission. On the other hand, if you think what matters for yourself is that you have the right values and the true beliefs, however you get them, then that's what matters to you, and not the investigation, interpretation, evaluation of things in the world. Now, it's easy in one's own case. In one's own case, probably all of us say, well, I'd rather make up my own mind about things, even if I get things wrong. But what about your neighbors and your friends? If you would rather that they came to false ideas and even pernicious values, but as a result of thinking things through, as a result of engaging in inquiry, then, well, you would invite them into your academic community. If, on the other hand, you would rather that they believed truly and valued soundly, however they got there, if it was through social pressure, psychological pressure, political pressure, or whatever, right, then for you, the purpose of the university can't be to allow people to engage freely with the things in the world. The purpose must be to inculcate the true beliefs and the sound values. So I think that's our situation, is that many people within the university people themselves, have decided, well, not as consciously as that, but are on the side of inculcating what they take to be true beliefs and sound values through whichever means are most efficient. Certainly the least efficient means are investigating the thing and engaging in critical discussion about it. Now, what can we do in face of that? Because after all, if you love for its own sake inquiring into things, then any reason that you give will be an external reason, will be a reason that engaging in intellectual endeavor is good for the sake of something else. Now, traditionally, those in the university who are keen to gather with others and exercise intellectual and moral autonomy to try to figure things out have let the experience of doing that speak for itself. And they haven't tried to justify it externally. And of course, trying to justify it externally isn't going to work very well. And so this is the problem that we face. A great number of professors, probably not the majority yet, but a great number of professors, and certainly the majority of administrators, don't think of the university as a place where people come together to exercise intellectual and moral autonomy to try to understand how things are. They think of the university as preparing students, as generating research that will lead to the correct outcomes, the politically or socially preferred outcomes. So how do we bring back the university to its academic purpose, its academic mission? How do we celebrate academic values? It's a difficult question. Now, Bruce, no doubt, is right that there's much that can be done structurally, but I worry about the chicken and egg problem there. Unless we have people committed to the academic mission, to academic values for their own sake, then the changes, whatever institutional changes can be brought about, are going to be resisted by the professors and students and the administrators. We've seen this in Ontario, in Canada, and Alberta. Both provincial governments have required that the universities formulate free speech, freedom of expression policies on campus modeled on the Chicago principles. And the universities have complied, but of course they haven't enforced them. They managed to get around them however they will, because that's the culture. So maybe we have to change the culture first, but it's difficult to see how to do that. So the academic culture on the one hand, the institutions on the other. I guess we have to try to work on both at the same time. In Canada, one of the things that stymies us is the lack of interest in what's happening in universities by the general public, by at least the news media. Maybe the public is more interested, but our news media is not particularly interested in these things. They don't take up the cases when they become public, and typically they're on the side of those who think that the functions of the university in preparing young people to take their places in the professional and managerial elite is the key to a university. So this is our problem. It's been made worse, much worse, by the pandemic. What's happened is that we've been unable to, my organization, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, used to hold public events, speakers, panel discussions and the like, and people would see posters and they'd come by to check it out. Well, now everything is by Zoom. First of all, no one wants to go to a Zoom meeting. And then secondly, the only people who know about the Zoom meeting are those who are on the mailing list. And the only people on our mailing list are people who already think pretty much as we do. So the administrations have taken advantage of the past 16 months now, 18 months now, in their a monopoly on getting the message out. We find that as venues are closed down just because of the pandemic, that's more and more difficult to get our messages out. That's an overview, maybe from a theoretical view, but I want to talk about some practical trends that, to my mind, are very worrying. One, of course, is the move by universities to disciplinary procedures. Now, this follows on the past 10 years, maybe gained steam in the last 6 years. The proliferation of safe and respectful campus policies, right? The widening of the concept of harassment, codes of behavior, revised and expanded codes of behavior for students and professors. This has allowed the administrators to to make allegations of violations of university codes and bring students into disciplinary procedures. As president of SAFS, I hear about some now and then, and many are shocking, and there are no doubt many more. But there's a secrecy and embarrassment by professors who've been alleged to have violated a safe and respectful campus policy. So we don't know just the extent of this problem. But even if the allegation is unfounded and is dismissed even before arbitration, while the damage has been done, the intimidation has been set in, and those people who know about what's going on are much more restrained than they were before. The safe and respectful campus policies are now making not only invective and actual harassment against the university policies, but the mere expression of certain opinions can now be counted as deserving of disciplinary action, because these opinions are interpreted as denying someone's humanity, or as a microaggression or the like. And this is one trend that is quiet. It's under the scenes, but I think it's increasing. Another is the support for by administrations for various social and political agendas. No one wants to stand up and say, "Well, I'm not for this anti-racism policy." The anti-racism policies are often false and pernicious. Those of us who champion fairness as the way to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity for the goods that education brings are set back on our heels by the fervor with which these social and political agendas are brought to campus, especially as Bruce and others have mentioned in the wake of the death of George Floyd. There's a movement in Canada by Universities Canada, which is the umbrella organization that brings in the presidents of the universities and some of the colleges in Canada to remove extramural utterance from academic freedom protections. The idea is that their idea is that academic freedom should protect only that which is of academic moment, and they want to draw firm lines between what professors say in, say, opinion pieces or blogs or Twitter, and their refereed journals. It's not a line that can be drawn easily, but they want to draw it. And moreover, the drawing of this line, the removal of extramural utterance from the protection of academic freedom, seems to have the backing of some of our faculty unions and faculty associations. The faculty unions and faculty associations, again, serious problem there. The absence of strong commitment to academic values and the power that they have. Our situation, again, agreeing with Bruce one more time, most of our universities, almost all of our universities are provincial institutions. We have very few private universities. The ones that we have tend to be religious institutions. That makes it very difficult for any particular university to set its own course, to make it a place of the academic mission and academic values. Last thing I'll mention are the problems about research and directed funding for research, and how universities themselves are now having professors apply for research funds. And if the research looks like it may not uphold preferred or received values, then it doesn't get funded, and so doesn't. These ideas don't get out into the mainstream. At any rate, I'll end there. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Mark. So to sum up, we've heard from three speakers, three different organizations, three different countries. So Toby Young, speaking for the Free Speech Union based in Britain, but as he noted, hoping to establish a branch in the United States this fall. And then Professor Bruce Gilley, who is a board member of the National Association of Scholars based in the United States. And Mark Mercer, president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which is based in Canada. So three different countries, three different organizations. There's a lot of potential cross-fertilization here. I think we've been quite descriptive and a little bit forecasting in our comments so far. I'm seeing in the Q&A and in the chat, there's already some concern from a personal perspective. Obviously going to have a lot of academics and some students and even maybe some administrators in the audience who are concerned rationally in a self-centered sort of way, how they protect themselves, protect their academic freedoms, particularly from the sort of woke administrators and activists that everybody is talking about. So can we summarize or give some general advice prescriptively to the audience what they should do if they feel they're in a position where they have to assert their free speech? Because obviously your options range a gamut from abject apology, tweeting that you were totally wrong and you're thankful for being educated in your wrongness, to hoping it blows over, to fighting back and fighting against a big institution like a university, particularly when it's your employer, is an intimidating thing to do. So I don't think we've talked yet prescriptively to the individual at the individual level. Does anybody want to lead with some lessons learned from their own country's experience, their own organizations learning institutional memory?
I'd be happy to say something on that topic. Just two things. One, if you have views that are unpopular, that you think might get you into trouble, make them known. Make them known in as respectable and academic a forum as you can find, right? So avoid Twitter, but make them known in, if you can write for a newspaper or a journal, let it be known that these are your views. Now, of course, this is not foolproof advice. There are people whose views have been, who've made their views known and have been attacked, even though they've made them known in respectable venues and have described their views and backed them up with arguments. But if you're just caught on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, I don't think you have the same sort. You won't have enjoy the same sort of protection, a student or professor, as you would if you've published these views in a academic, or quasi-academic, or public forum. So that's my first piece of advice. The second thing I want to say is that try to find spaces with other people who are happy to talk freely. Not necessarily people who share your views, but people who share your views about freedom of expression, who share your views about inquiry. And so find areas where you can discuss with people that you can more or less trust to discuss with you. So those are the two things I would say.
Thank you, Mark.
I would say, at the risk of disagreeing with Mark, I think you should get on Twitter. I think you should get on Twitter and you should blast your colleagues. I think you should be obnoxious, and I think you should stand up for what you believe in, because I just think there's this slippery slope of, this just sounds like the Soviet Union. It's like, well, stay quiet and, don't be too loud, and try to find some allies who might give you respectability. It doesn't work. Okay. I mean, I think we know enough examples way beyond myself where you publish something in a reputable journal or a reputable policy journal, and you got called out for it by some whack jobs in the academy. And it was precisely because it was published in a reputable journal that they took offense, right? Because it somehow made it into the citadel, and had made it into the sacred space. And I think it doesn't help to do that. So first thing is, be bold, be strong, be outspoken. And then to piggyback on what Toby said is, you got to get some steel in your back, because one thing that we know about the cancel culture and the academic mobs is they are basically emotionally arrested development individuals for the most part, right? They're like middle school kids, and they actually don't have much staying power. What they look for is any evidence that you're going to apologize, that you're sorry, that you say sorry without anything to be sorry for, that you start trying to rephrase what you said. Oh, I should have used better words, and I didn't meant to cut. That's what they're looking for, right? And so what we've learned, I think, in all of our cases is absolutely the worst thing to do is to apologize or to pull in your horns, because that's what they're looking for. What you need to do is restate it in even bolder terms, and tweet it too, by the way, and let them know that you're not going to shrink away. And the lesson of that is a day later, they'll all be gone. You know, I mean, look at Elizabeth Wise at San Diego State and her book on, basically how kind of repatriation of archaeological remains has become captured by kind of woke Native American activists and is completely unscientific. And of course, this was a book, to your point, Bart, this was a scholarly book that she had published 2 years ago with another scholar, and they suddenly found it, right? And I mean, 2 years ago it was not remarkable, and suddenly it's offensive and causes trauma to Native students and microaggressions and whatnot. And what we said to Elizabeth when she contacted us, we says, don't back down, back up. It's the 180. I would call this the 180, right? When you're thinking of going this way, do a 180 degrees and go that way. And I think for the case of academic freedom, you go absolutely charging into the mob, because it turns out they're going to scatter like the wind, right? They are basically a bunch of emotionally arrested development adolescents who couldn't get a job in the real world have ended up in the academy, such as it is. So that's one thing. Secondly, get support, not just from the NAS, the Free Speech Union, like-minded scholars. They will create petitions, but also, and this is, I think, one of the ways the US is very strong, we have a large alt media now. We have a very vibrant alt media that has basically end run the traditional media and is getting a lot more views, a lot more impact. Even in Canada, Mark, you've got True North and some other organizations which are doing great stuff, right? And producing, giving voice to academics who are under threat in a way that the mainstream media will not touch. In the case of the United States, this also means getting a lawyer. I hate to say it, but it does. It costs you $500 to have a strongly worded letter sent to the university. The moment they get that letter, believe me, they will back down. So I think, that I hate to say it, right? Because we all just actually want to do our work and get on with our research. None of us wanted to be involved in these kind of battles. But the point is, if you're going to be in this space, you're going to have to do these battles. And the way to do these battles is full on 110% charging into the cancel culture.
Yeah.
That's something Bruce just to what Bruce has said. Again, I think he's right, but it's not just the mob. And I think, people should be aware of that. It's also university vice presidents and university presidents. The problem there is that they don't discuss, they don't talk. In Canada, at least, the degree to which their arbitrariness is protected is astonishing. They don't have to justify. In Canada, when an allegation of violating a university policy is laid against a professor, the burden of proof doesn't rest on the university until the university assigns discipline, and then only if the union grieves. And the union may not grieve, and the union may not take it up vigorously. In Canada, unlike the States, the faculty union of faculty association is representing not the professor, but all the professors, or representing itself. So there's no place for one's own lawyer. The mob might back down if you show some steel, if you have steel in your spine. The university administrators might not. They don't have to. It doesn't much matter to them. They can get what they want, and the rules and the procedures are there that allow them to do so. So I just wanted to add that, at least for those in Canada and political cultures that are like ours.
Yes, I don't know if Toby Young is still present. He had to leave early, but if I could speak for the Free Speech Union, if I can paraphrase what he might have said, I think he would agree with Professor Gilley that you have to be prepared to send a legal letter, because yeah, it doesn't mean that you're going to do that, but unfortunately, you have to be prepared to escalate, and organizations like the Free Speech Union can help organize that. As he mentioned in his talk earlier, the Free Speech Union board, includes lawyers who specialize in this. So that's an unfortunate option that we all need to consider. A lot of academics, like Professor Gilley said, we didn't get into academia to start litigating, but increasingly, I think that's where we have to be prepared to go if we are prepared to defend our position at all. I think there's some interesting spaces that you've collectively mentioned where we fight our case. So social media, I think all the organizations would agree that you don't roll over and apologize, because that's a sign of weakness that encourages the mob to pile on. Alt media is a good place to take your case and draw publicity, which might be in media that your institution doesn't read itself, but still it can care about, where that news could spread to other media and damage its reputation. Now, I think Mark Mercer raises a good point about how difficult it is to fight your case inside your institution itself, when you're dealing with very opaque rules and even unwritten rules. And I think we should discuss that, because we get a lot of complaints from academics about how they are accused of things and they're not even fully, the accusation isn't fully revealed to them. The accuser isn't fully revealed to them. So they're not in a position to even defend themselves. And that's defend themselves within the institution, but also in civil court. How do you word that letter from your lawyer if you're not being told fully what you're being accused of? And even if you're accused of something specific, it can be, well, specific, it's still vague. So your tweets, we had the famous case of Mike McCulloch in Britain. He was suspended, he was disciplined with, the intent was clearly to dismiss him for some tweets that misgendered, but the accusation was that his tweets were rude. So it was vague. It wasn't about the specific content. They weren't quoting specific content in his tweets. The accusation was that tweets in general were rude. It's very difficult to defend yourself against somebody who, or an institution which is being vague like that. And then there are sort of procedural punishments, institutional cultural punishments that can amount to constructive dismissal, where life is just made very difficult to you, for you. So the institution might choose not to reveal enough about its complaint against you to enable you to defend yourself, but it will reveal enough to mobilize the mob against you. And then there are other procedural punishments, for want of a better word, the institution can engage in, such as not approving courses you really want to teach, or limiting the amount of students who can take your courses, denying research funding, raising unreasonable expectations if you're tenure track, and things like that. So it seems to me, you can argue with me on this. I think fighting the institution fighting within your own institution is probably the most challenging space in which one has to protect one's freedoms. Does anybody want to run with that? I don't think we have Toby Young. So
I will just say something. Sorry, I thought Mark was going to jump in there. I think you're right, and I think I've seen Francis Widdowson point out that the internal star chamber processes are by far the most threatening, for the reasons you mentioned, Bruce, was because they're secretive, and they're intended to be secretive, right? You do need a lawyer with you And when your university says, oh, you can't bring a lawyer, tell them, I am bringing my lawyer. That's my choice, not yours. And then they'll back down. That's what happened with me with my diversity investigation. And I'm sure that's what's happened with others. I think one thing to keep in mind is, revolutions tend to destroy themselves. Now, the problem is that they create a tremendous amount of havoc and destruction by the time they finally play out. But this revolution is in fact eating its young. We don't notice it because we don't pay attention when a critical gender studies professor criticizes a critical Black studies professor of misogynoir, and he criticizes her back of lesbian anti-classicist ableism, right? Because it's all just kind of like static to us, and we don't pay attention. But what's happening in a lot of these internal disciplinary processes is most of the people being dragged up before them are actually like radical academics themselves, right? Because what's happened is the institutions, and this is happening in other cultural institutions as well. This is happening in the arts. This is happening in the media. This is happening in sports. This is happening in major corporations, is that the processes that have been set in place in order to kind of weed out liberals, classical liberals and conservatives like us, have actually been deployed most often against fellow radicals. In part, okay, this is simply because in a lot of these institutions, 99% of the people are radicals anyway. So just by definition, the probability is these processes are going to be deployed against radicals because that's all that's there. But I think another reason is that revolutionary movements and revolutionary rhetoric and revolutionary ideology is constantly seeking enemies of minute differences and minute microaggressions, right? And a lot of these people who are actually being dragged up before diversity councils are actually people who themselves support the diversity agenda, right? In fact, they may demand even more out of the diversity agenda, but find themselves pulled up before it. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that there is a sort of a change that's happening with these. I mean, I've noticed this in my own institution that 5 years ago they would have gone, every single student complaint about being being offended by something the professor said in the class, they would go charging in and they'd arrest the professor and drag them in. And nowadays they're increasingly saying no, we're not going into it. We've been down so many of those investigations, and we realize that they're being completely misusing our resources and whatnot. So there is a kind of, I don't want to call waited out kind of situation, but I do think that these processes go through this revolutionary cycle, and I think we're in the middle of it now, so we may not notice it, but there will be a kind of burning out of this procedure. Meanwhile, I think my biggest advice to people is don't make comments on your home institution. And if you need to make comments on your home institution, have a friend who's at another institution make those comments, right? Because those disciplinary procedures depend upon you and your behavior and speech with respect to your home institution. If you're commenting on someone else's university and they're commenting on your university, they can't touch you, right? Because another university's institutional process cannot touch me for criticizing them. And that's, I think, a really important one, is just keep your focus on the outside world, not on your home institution. And again, I would say that is the same in arts, sports, media, corporations, same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Gilley. So it's a good job this is being recorded, because I can see the audience is going to want to replay a lot of that advice. So look, I've got we've been very prescriptive just now, but I've got a descriptive issue to raise. So this goes back, I think, to Professor Gilley. You were first to raise Catholic institutions as our hope for free or anti-woke institutions of higher learning. And we've got two questions here which are sort of pushing back on that. So Sherman says here, can someone say a bit more about Catholic universities? My casual impression is that some of the worst universities, e.g. DePaul, are Catholic. And then Tricia has said, how can one find the top universities with the least woke administrations? Are they all Catholic or evangelical? So, and I'll add thirdly, I'm going to push back you, Professor Gilley, a bit on this too, because I'm at a Catholic university, University of San Diego, and I actually chose this university in part because I thought it would be more conservative with a small c on these issues, but it's suddenly gone very woke. And there's lots of strands of Catholicism, and Catholicism can be very woke. So, is it, do you want to qualify your confidence in Catholic universities being our hope here?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say if only 50% of Catholic universities are woke, that makes them 50% better than all other universities. So, it's all relative. And I do think, I mean, I'm thinking about, the recent republication of Churchill's The River War, the magnificently annotated and edited and reprinted full original manuscript of The River War, that was done by a Catholic press, Catholic University Press here in the U.S. and edited by a University of Alaska professor. University of Alaska is a state university, but thank God it's in a red state. So I think it has a certain degree of, red state kind of academic freedom. And then it's published by a Catholic University Press. I mean, these are islands. That doesn't mean, universities in red states are all not woke. No, they're probably 50% of them or more are woke. But again, that's 50% more that are not woke than in blue states and in standard academic presses. I mean, to the same point, academic presses at this point have become essentially Soviet-style agitprop. They might as well call themselves the People's Press at this point. The University of California Press, with which I've published 2 books, decided it needed to issue a statement in solidarity with the people of Palestine 2 weeks ago. As if like it's the job of a university press to make political statements like that. So it's all relative. I'm not saying Catholic universities are perfect, but they're a lot less imperfect than the standard ones.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. The Catholic institutions, Catholic universities in Canada became public universities in the 60s and 70s. I'm at one, St. Mary's University, public university since 1970. But I do think there is a bit of the atmosphere is different, I think, at the universities that were Catholic than the ones that weren't. There's a deference to religious sensibilities at St. Mary's. Maybe I shouldn't overgeneralize that I didn't find at other universities that had a secular or Protestant origin. And that's a deference to religious sensibilities, whether they are Christian or not. And I think I talked to one student said, well, I was at University of Toronto, I didn't like it. I came to St. Mary's. Well, why didn't you like it? Well, they were always criticizing my Christianity. And now here at St. Mary's, it's fine. It's just nothing remarkable. So there is that. But no, I don't have anything to say about the point that Bruce is making, simply because there are no well-known Catholic universities. There are some Catholic high schools still in the country, but no, we don't have large Catholic universities, so I don't know what the experience there is.
Right, thank you. So I think one level of analysis that I think Professor Gilley was first to mention just now was, you phrased it as red states. That reminds me that we should bring in the states as a level of analysis here, because we've talked a bit about federal protections, national law in the British case, federal in the Canadian and US case. But the states, some of the states are leading the fight to legislate protections against things like critical race theory specifically. So states like Florida, South Dakota, and recently Texas have legislated that there are certain things that won't be taught in public institutions, such as critical race theory. And that contrasts a lot with the state of California, which mandates critical race theory in at secondary school level. So, and in fact, I mean, David Randall just betrayed live on air that I'm defecting to the University of Texas, which was, thank you, David, that wasn't public knowledge, but it gives me the opportunity to say one of the reasons why I'm attracted to going to the University of Texas is because I believe the state of Texas will protect my academic freedoms better than the state of California. So is it a good advice to academics to think about which state you work in?
You know, I want to talk a little bit about this issue of, you know, banning critical race theory. I mean, it's a little bit misunderstood. So what's happening, of course, is they're legislating about K to 12, right? They're not legislating about universities. We would never want anything to be banned at a university. You know, whatever lunatic idea has currency. I think the issue with universities is, you know, we want an open play of ideas. We want scientific standards. We want somehow to be able to cross our partisan divides and recognize greatness, even when we disagree with it. You know, I'd be the first one to recognize the greatness of Edward Said, for example, and his work. I'd be the first to recognize the greatness of, you know, Emmanuel Wallerstein's world systems analysis. I mean, you know, we all recognize smart, intelligent people who have ideas that we think are profoundly wrong, but we agree reach a very high level of scientific standards and excellence in logic and evidence and openness to evaluation. So, you know, clearly whatever we do in the K to 12 space, which is different. The problem with K-12 is you have to mandate what's taught, right? So by necessity, you need to make a choice about what's taught. So it's wrong to think that this is censorship. This is curriculum development, right? And the curriculum has been pulled in the direction of basically teaching a certain way that intelligent people think is not an accurate or useful way to teach young people. So it's not an academic freedom issue, right? It's a curriculum issue, and debates on curriculum are longstanding. When it comes to universities, so on the one hand, I would say, you know, we would never want to ban anything, right? You could think, and if your research leads you in the direction of new things that is not what you were hired for, who cares, right? I was certainly not hired because I think that colonialism was an unambiguous good, and I'm sure I would not have been hired if I had made that as my job talk. But anyways, here I am, and the point of a university is to protect me in my research, having gone in this direction. That said, okay, I do want to say that when I hear the sort of, you know, my friends in the heterodox academy saying, well, we just need to revive kind of classical liberalism and openness to debate and multiple perspectives, my answer to them is, when we get to the point where multiple perspectives are actually represented in the university, then come talk to me, because we are so far away from anything remotely resembling what the educated public thinks about most issues in university, that we do need, I think, an imposition of a certain kind of social engineering to revive the university, to make sure it actually reflects a variety of perspectives. And in order to get that, I think you do need to say, we're not hiring any more Black studies professors. We're not hiring any more feminists. We're not hiring any more radical ecologists. We're not. And it's not because we don't think that those ideas don't have a place. The reason is because we need to revive the space for the ideas that actually circulate among intelligent people. So at a certain point, I would love us to get back to a point where, you know, the state legislature has no role in the university. The provincial government has no role in the university. The university is an incredibly vibrant place, multiple perspectives, which naturally, therefore, will arise on both sides of the political spectrum. But we're nowhere near that. So I have no problem saying we're done funding Black studies professors. We're done funding, you know, ecofeminists and Marxists in urban studies, because they have absolutely dominated and wiped out the intellectual pluralism that they were supposed to uphold. And they have betrayed their role as university professors. And the time now is actually for the use of coercive policy and legislative action to reinvigorate pluralism. And by the way, this is an argument that the left makes all the time, that markets don't function without government, and all these market fundamentalists, they just think that government's not important. And I say, yeah, I'm on side with that. I have no doubt that a well-functioning government is critical to upholding markets, but it's also critical to upholding a market of ideas, which is what the university is supposed to be.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we've got to clarify something else quickly, which is public funding, because it has been mentioned a few times. There are some special opportunities for protecting academic freedoms through public funding. And this is where I'm going to cross-fertilize from the British case. So Britain has this special protection for academics, which might be true in Canada too. But I should say Britain does not have constitutional protections of free speech like the United States, but it does have this rather unusual protection through the Human Rights Act of 1998, where the act obliges any publicly funded organization, whether it's academic or not, but including publicly funded universities, most of them are publicly funded, it obliges any publicly funded institution to protect their employees' freedom of speech. Now, this is the main way in which the Free Speech Union protects the freedom of speech of academics legally, through tort, through warning letters from lawyers. They remind institutions, you're supposed to protect this and you're persecuting their free speech. Now, there are other ways to use public funding. I'll just note what many people should know. President Trump threatened federal funding, or linked, let's say he linked federal funding to universities with their performance on protecting free speech. Is this a way to go? And is this a way to go for not just federal and state governments, but also individuals? Could individuals draw attention to issues and then try to link public funding with it by saying, look, my institution is not protecting me. Is it appropriate for academics to take that to their state legislature or their federal government and say, look, maybe you should be withholding public funds until my freedoms are protected?
I worry about getting the government involved in any way at all. Not only on principle, but I just I don't know of any politicians in Canada who are competent to look at Canadian universities. First of all, I don't think we have any commitment among Canadian politicians to civil liberties in the first place. So there's no motivation for them to want to protect freedom of expression on campus or academic freedom if they don't care about freedom of expression generally. I think that, and again, I'm speaking about the Canadian context, that trying to get the politicians involved is just going to make things worse, at least until the ground at the university is somewhat different. The experience of Ontario and Alberta with the imposition by the governments of the Chicago principles, well, it wasn't a disaster, but nothing happened. The universities managed to get around it by security fees, the safe and respectful campus policies. If there were a good popular movement by the people and the politicians responded to that, then that might give us some hope. But I just don't think in Canada at least, the conditions are right for government involvement. Academics, even those who are in favor of academic freedom and collegiality and all the wonderful things, would rebel if governments were trying to step in even more. The irony, of course, is that governments are taking an active role in universities, and on the wrong side. University funding is universities are a provincial matter, and university funding is a provincial matter for the most part. But then the federal government disperses research funds but the research funds they disperse are keyed to areas in the social justice movements, ends and means of researching ends and means of social justice, and in that way, are influencing what happens in universities and diminishing our academic freedom. If I worry if governments were to get involved, they wouldn't do it well.
Professor Gilley?
Yeah, I don't know how much worse it can get, Mark. I mean, academics have completely betrayed and undermined the purpose of the university. So, I mean, what worse could a politician do? Except at least it would be accountable and responsive destruction, as opposed to unaccountable and unresponsive destruction in the worst case. Secondly, I think political intervention works now, but it has to basically use a leverage point that works. And what is the leverage point that works against the faculty is their salaries. That's the only thing that works, is their salaries. So what did the Trump administration do? It said, if you mandate critical race theory training among your staff and faculty, you will be denied access to federal funding and research dollars. Within days, dozens of universities suspended mandatory critical race theory training for staff and faculty because of that threat. Trump administration also said, if you declare yourself a sanctuary campus, you're in violation of federal law, and you also will render your federal research dollars at risk, right? Now, that didn't take hold as quickly because there weren't that many universities which had declared themselves sanctuary campuses. But believe me, if that had continued, that would have made a difference as well. So I think, telling them to pass the Chicago principles, I agree, will do nothing. But that's because that doesn't affect the pocketbook of the faculty. Threaten their wallets, threaten their federal research dollars, and threaten their new hires. That will work. Secondly, is I think we need to train politicians. I mean, we can't just say to the politicians, go do the job of restoring academic freedom and generally kind of free speech amidst our cultural institutions. And in the case of Canada and the UK, this is the BBC and the CBC as well. And this is also, your art institutions and your sports institutions. You need to work with politicians to train them to understand what the issues are and how they can respond effectively to what they're going to get from the academics, which is a bunch of jargon and word salad that is going to prevent them. It's going to tongue tie them. They're not going to be able to act. So our organization, Oregon Association of Scholars, recently produced something called a cheat sheet for policymakers for responding to social justice rhetoric. It's been a big hit. We've got 20,000 downloads. It is on the OregonScholars.org website in both a printable and a graphical format. We're getting lots of take up from mainly Republican legislative caucuses at the state level. And what it is it takes 12 concepts in the social justice repertoire, like equity, diversity, white supremacy, decolonization, cultural competence, all this word salad that gets thrown out, and it allows politicians to decode those terms. So there's basically, here's what the word is, here's what it really means, and here's what's wrong with it, okay? Now, that's the kind of role that I think as people concerned with academic freedom and free speech generally, we have a responsibility to help politicians do their job, okay? Because don't forget, politicians are busy people. They have a lot of things to worry about. And when you throw them into settings of like a committee hearing to confirm a university board of governors or something, and one of the nominees say, I think we need to increase equity and we need to diversity, and suddenly the politicians are tongue-tied. They don't know what to say. Like Mark said, who's going to say I'm against anti-racism training, right? We need to educate them so that they know what these terms really are and why they are a threat to academic freedom, right? And that requires a little bit of work, a little bit of outside work, a little bit of coaching, right? But just because it's hard to work through the politicians doesn't mean I don't think the politicians are the way to go. I think, alas, they are.
Thank you. So I've got a responsive, reactive question from the audience here that possibly goes back to you, Professor Gilley. I think you might have been first to mention curriculum development. So the question from Lee Knopf is not curriculum development just another way to advance oppressive agendas? And it is not a vehicle, I think that should be, and is it not a vehicle that effectively enables obfuscation and the hiding of those agendas? Question mark.
Well, yeah, so it's the reason why, you know, K to 12 curriculum have been argued over for 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, since the 60s, really. So that's nothing new. That's okay. That's healthy. I mean, it's good to have, you know, school boards and parents involved in these sort of active debates on what should be taught. You know, I was in a meeting a few days ago where someone pointed out that it's actually in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 that parents should have primary responsibility over what their children are taught. It's actually a human right. And so that means parents being involved in curriculum development. And, you know, I think if the implication of the question is, you know, these busy parents who are, you know, trying to get the dinner on the table and trying to get the kids to soccer practice are thrown into a school board meeting with these woke educators, they're going to be bombarded with all this social justice rhetoric, and they're going to be told that they're racist and oppressive for even suggesting that, you know, Black Lives Matter should not be the dominant curriculum item in the fall. I think, you know, that's why we need training, and we need kind of consciousness raising. There's a nice old term to enable people to push back on this social justice pedagogy, and which is, you know, then migrates out of K to 12 into the education schools, and then migrates from education schools into K to 12, and K to 12 into the colleges, and then colleges into our broader cultural institutions. I mean, so we need to learn how to talk back to this kind of social justice issues. But, you know, at the level of higher education, you know, there shouldn't be a mandated curriculum. I mean, the only curriculum in the Department of Chemistry should be what the chemistry professors feel is the critical training for people who are going to take chemistry. I mean, that's it, right? The idea that you should have some mandatory university-wide, you know, diversity training or race and ethnic studies course like we now have at my university, you know, it's a violation of disciplinary prerogatives over what should be taught. And it does open a door, precisely, if, as the question suggests, to the imposition of essentially, you know, agitprop into the curriculum where it doesn't belong.
Thank you. So, Mark, do you have something quick to add to that?
Well, I'd add that this is a real worry. It's on the list at universities in Canada. The departments, what used to be department responsibilities and department prerogatives, are now moving up to the dean's level, and the protection, the academic freedom protections that are tied to a department oversight are being loosened. The individual professors, we used to have much more say in the courses we and our colleagues would develop, but that's now moving up to the office of the deans. How to stop these things? It's not clear how to stop them. If our unions took the collective agreement more seriously, then the union would be useful. But the movement from the individual professors and the departments to the higher levels is another way in which academic freedom and freedom of expression on campus are being eroded, and of course academic standards.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. So if I can ask for final statements, I don't think Toby Young has come back in. So unless he says otherwise, it's going to be Professor Gilley and then Mark Mercer. So Professor Gilley.
Yeah, well, so the conversation is useful because I think what I'm hearing coming out of this conversation is, where do we focus our energies? Do we continue to sort of argue at the campus level, or do we need to broaden to a social and a political level? I mean, I guess I wish, like Mark, I had faith in the capacity of intelligent people to follow evidence and logic and objectivity, and to accept the limitations of their perspective and return us to a toga-clad classical situation, but I just don't see it happening. I look very bad in a toga myself, and I don't think it's where we are. So I think, the reason why the NAS and the Free Speech Union and SAFs are important, as Mark alluded to, is because they work not just on campus, but more broadly in society. And I honestly think that, we need to focus our energies on what's called the room outside the room, right? The room outside the room is the broader society, the educated public, the responsible politicians, the advocacy groups. I think that's the room we need to speak to. And if anyone on campus happens to listen and have second thoughts about what they're doing, that's a bonus, but I don't think that's our target audience.
Well, I agree with Bruce that we have to get these matters discussed in public more generally. Forgive my pessimism. The difficulty in doing so, in being heard, I think is real and is for many of us dispiriting. I'll add that that we can't forget the individual cases. There are actual individual professors, many of whom are at this meeting, who have been personally affected by disdain for academic freedom and declining academic standards. And we need our energies there as well. We have to be active everywhere, and I would love for there to be politicians who cared. How to make them care is another question. There doesn't seem to be a constituency that they need to serve in order to be elected. So unlike the professors whose salaries you can threaten, there are very few politicians who will take up the universities as a way of ensuring that they get into office or remain in office.
All right, thank you. So before David Randall comes back in, I'm just going to quickly thank Toby Young, President of the Free Speech Union, for speaking with us, Professor Bruce Gilley, Board Member of National Association of Scholars, Political Scientist of Portland, and Mark Mercer, President of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship in Canada. Thank you to the Free Speech Union and National Association of Scholars, particularly for organizing this webinar. And thank you, David Randall. David, over to you.
Thank you. And I will just say thank you, Bruce Newsom, for, well, not only moderating this, but I got sparking this. And it was originally his idea. And I must say it's been a wonderful one. Thank you very much. So look, I'll just say again, the bit that, this has been recorded. You will be able to watch this within 24 hours. It will be on our National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, either ones you asked which weren't answered or ones which come to you, please send them to me. That's David Randall, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be glad to forward them to any of the participants. And, I'll just leave it that, look, the point of this was, we're not alone even in one country in this fight. We're all in this together. We are learning from one another, and heavens, we're productively discussing the ways forward. We can learn, we will learn. Maybe the next one will get people from Israel and France and Hungary and Japan and so on. But it's a fight all over the world, and not only is a worldwide challenge, but it's a challenge where we have friends and allies worldwide, and that's always worth remembering. So thank you all, and I think I'll close that now.